Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. Everything started so subtly that I couldn't even pinpoint the moment when the crack in my relationship with Mark became a chasm. Questions that I never asked before began to haunt me. When was the last time I saw him laugh? When did we simply talk without trying to break through the walls of exhaustion? Our days blended into a monotonous rhythm, like an old vinyl record, repeating the same phrases over and over. We lived together, but we were drifting further and further apart. I stood by the window, watching the street below. The dusty glass reminded me of our relationship, once clear and transparent, now covered in layers of unspoken grievances and unmet expectations. "Rachel, I'll be late tonight," Mark's voice came from the kitchen. He was busy gathering papers for yet another business meeting. We barely saw each other lately, and even when we were home, it was as if we passed by each other. He was always so focused on his work, on the endless tasks that consumed both his time and attention. I used to be proud of his ambition, but now it felt like a wall, one behind which I could no longer find either him or myself. "Of course," I replied, without taking my eyes off the street. At that moment, for the first time in a long while, I thought that things didn't have to be this way. But how could I break out of this routine? I felt stuck, like a ship adrift, while life around me continued moving forward. When Jason appeared at our doorstep, I had no idea it would change everything. Mark's younger brother had always been like a perpetual wanderer to me, someone who could leave at any moment, following his whims. His return after a long absence was unexpected but refreshing. He burst into our settled, almost stagnant life like a breeze from the ocean. Fresh, a bit cold, but awakening something forgotten. "Well, big sis, how's life?" His voice was still as light and slightly teasing as I remembered. Jason and I had always gotten along, even though he was the complete opposite of Mark. Where my husband was reserved, collected, and detail-oriented, Jason was chaotic, impulsive, but irresistibly free. That freedom, it always drew me in. "As you can see, not much has changed," I smiled, but there was a note of weariness in my voice. Jason raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Our eyes met, and I realized he had noticed the small crack I had been hiding for so long. "You know, there's an event this weekend. Want to go? A music festival, like in the old days. Songs, dancing under the stars, lights in the night. Remember how it used to be?" His offer caught me off guard. The last time I had been to something like that was with Mark, and it felt like a lifetime ago. "I'm not sure I started, but he interrupted, leaning in closer as if he had seen right through me. "Rachel, do you really want to spend this weekend like all the others? It's time to shake things up. It's just a festival." His words awakened something in me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Something I wanted but hadn't dared to admit. Freedom, the feeling of life outside these walls, beyond the familiar boundaries. I agreed. Mark didn't even notice my departure, so absorbed was he in his endless meetings and calls. Jason and I headed to the festival, and I felt strange. It was like that feeling before a storm, when the air thickens and every moment seems significant, as if everything around was about to change. Music filled the air the moment we arrived. Colorful lights, crowds of people, laughter and conversations blended into a single noise that was overwhelming, but also liberating. I could feel life surging around me, like a wave ready to sweep me off my steady ground. "Hey, look!" Jason pointed to the stage where the band was playing something wild and edgy. Suddenly, I realized I hadn't felt this kind of lightness in ages. We walked between tents, laughing, talking about everything and nothing, and all the while, something hung in the air, unspoken, yet undeniable. At some point, we stopped by a small stage where a crowd was dancing. I didn't notice when Jason took my hand. His touch was simple, but somehow too noticeable. He leaned in closer to shout over the noise, "Remember when you and Mark used to dance? It was fun. When was the last time you two just danced? His words hit the mark. I couldn't even remember. All I could recall were long, silent nights. Had I really forgotten what it felt like to live, to feel? I didn't respond. I just let myself dance with the crowd. The music took hold of me, and for a moment, all my worries dissolved into the rhythm. But deep inside, I knew that this night would change more than just my mood. When Jason and I returned home, something had shifted between us. The crack, which had started as innocent flirting, was now deepening. When Mark said he was leaving for a weekend business trip, I felt something strange, almost imperceptible, like a faint tingling under my skin. Freedom? Or was it the fear of what that freedom might bring me? He quickly packed his things, planted a quick kiss on my cheek, and disappeared through the door, leaving behind only the hollow sound of it closing. I was left in the silence. With Jason. I sat on the couch, trying to immerse myself in a book, but the words wouldn't stick in my mind. Something was bothering me, distracting me. Every time I heard Jason's footsteps in the next room, my heart beat a little faster than usual. He was there, just beyond the wall, and the thought wouldn't leave me. Why was I reacting this way to his presence? That day, he came into the room with an offer I had secretly been expecting. "Hey, why are we sitting at home?" Jason said, settling beside me on the couch. His voice was casual, almost matter of fact, but there was a playful spark in his eyes. "There's a car show nearby. They say it's going to be great, and if you're not into cars, we can head to a rooftop party. You need a break." I sighed, as if resisting myself, but deep down, I knew I didn't want to say no. A car show? I pressed my lips together, trying not to reveal how much the thought of spending time with him excited me. Why not? The car show felt like stepping into another world. The roar of engines, the smell of gasoline and burning rubber, the excited voices of the crowd. It was a real celebration for those who lived for speed and adrenaline. We walked among the people, and I felt like I was part of something huge, loud, and wild, like those cars tearing off the starting line with a deafening screech. "Look at this!" Jason stopped by one of the exhibition cars, his eyes glowing with excitement, like a kid who had just seen the toy of his dreams. "Pretty cool, huh?" I nodded. Though honestly, cars didn't interest me much. What captivated me more was the moment itself, the way Jason was so absorbed by it all. His enthusiasm was contagious, and I found myself smiling just watching him. Then we moved over to the races. The crowd gathered along the track, and there was a tense silence in the air before the start. Standing beside me, Jason pulled me closer so I could see better. His hand landed on my shoulder, a fleeting touch, but it made me shiver. "This isn't right," I told myself, but my body responded faster than my mind. When the cars sped off, the crowd erupted in cheers, and I tried to focus on the race, on the furious speeds, on the roar of the engines. But in my world, there was only one thing: Jason standing beside me, his hand on my shoulder. That simple touch stirred me more than all the noise and motion around us. "Ready for the next part of the show?" He leaned in close to my ear to shout over the noise, and I felt his breath on my neck. I was ready for anything that moment might mean, though I couldn't admit it to myself. After the car show, he suggested we head to the rooftop party. Evening had settled over the city, the sky darkened, and the lights of the city shimmered like stars. Music drifted down from the top floors of the building, and I heard it as soon as we stepped out of the car. We rode the elevator up to the rooftop. A small crowd had already gathered. Laughter, conversations, music vibrating through the air. It surrounded us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the world was narrowing, centering on the two of us. I stood at the edge, looking out over the city lights, when he came closer. "Beautiful, isn't it?" His voice was quiet, almost intimate. I nodded. We stood there, side by side, and the moment between us became more and more palpable. I could feel his presence so sharply, as if the night itself had thickened around us. There was a spark between us, one I had tried to ignore, but now it was growing, no matter how hard I tried to suppress it. We were silent, but it was a silence heavy with meaning. Suddenly, he brushed his hand against mine. It was just a moment, an innocent touch, it seemed, but it jolted me, like a shock. I flinched. Our eyes met. Sorry, he smiled faintly, pulling his hand away. But there was something more in his eyes. He knew. I knew. We both understood that this moment wasn't accidental. I wanted to say something, to break the tension, but the words caught in my throat. We stood there, bathed in the glow of the city lights, and that touch still lingered between us, like an unresolved question. On the way back, we were quiet. The elevator carried us down, back to the real world, but his touch kept echoing in my mind. I was confused. What did it mean? Why did his presence affect me so deeply? When the elevator doors opened, our hands brushed together again, this time accidentally, and I felt something more. It was like a spark, brief but strong, disorienting. I looked at him, but Jason had already turned away, as if he wasn't sure what had just happened either. It's late, I said quietly, trying to ground myself back in reality. Yeah? He nodded, his voice rough, barely audible. Good night, Rachel. And when I entered my bedroom, alone, I realized that this time, the crack had deepened even more. The night was warm, with a gentle breeze that barely brushed against the skin, as if trying to remind me that freedom wasn't just a word, but a feeling that could seep deep into you, like air filling your lungs. Jason and I had arrived at a poolside party, where everything was loud, lively, full of music and laughter. Around me were dancing people, flashes of light, the rhythm of the bass vibrating through my chest. I stood by the edge of the pool, gazing into the water illuminated by colorful lights. But my thoughts were far away. Jason appeared beside me, as usual, effortlessly and casually. There was that spark in his eyes, the one I had started noticing more often than I would have liked. That spark that was beginning to scare me with its persistence. He looked at me, and I realized he felt the same tension that I did. Want to go up to the roof? He suggested, leaning toward me so his voice could break through the noise of the party. It's too crowded here. I nodded, unable to say anything. We headed for the stairs, climbing the narrow steps, past people who seemed to live in their own, simpler world. And me? With every step, I felt something tightening inside me, but strangely, it didn't make me want to stop. When we reached the roof, we were greeted by silence. Below, music still played. Laughter and fun continued. But up here, at this height, it was a different space. The silence felt like a separate universe where we could be ourselves without pretending. Jason sat on a low bench at the edge of the roof, and I sat down next to him. How are you? His voice was soft, even caring. His gaze stayed on me, and I felt that I could no longer hold back. Everything that had built up inside just had to come out. I don't know, I began, not looking at him. Lately, I feel lost. In my marriage with Mark, it feels like something's gone. I can't pinpoint when it happened, but the sense of emptiness haunts me. It's like we're living parallel lives, and the more I try to reach him, the more I feel this gap. I spoke and felt the words pouring out, as if a long-locked dam had finally burst. I wasn't sure why I was saying this to Jason. Maybe because he was the one who listened? Or maybe because his presence stirred something in me that I couldn't afford to admit. Jason listened without interrupting. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, looking out at the city lights below, and his silence was somehow calming. When I finished, he finally spoke. You know, Rachel, I've always felt a bit out of place in this family. Mark, he's always been the one everyone saw as the example. He was successful, smart, stable, and I was always in the background, not quite fitting into their perfect picture. Maybe that's why I kept running away whenever I had the chance. I just didn't feel like I belonged here. He said this with bitterness, but without malice. Just a fact, as if he had long since accepted it. and was now voicing something he'd kept inside for years. Mark was always the right one, he continued, and I sensed that there was more to his words than just a comparison between brothers. But sometimes being right pushes people away. You feel that, don't you? I nodded, unable to speak. Everything he said struck at the very chords that had been touched before, but I had never allowed myself to think about them. Mark was the right one. He was perfect. But in that perfection, I was losing myself. Silence hung between us. Jason looked at me, and I suddenly felt that this moment wasn't just a coincidence. It was somehow inevitable. The night, the stars, our conversation. All of it created a strange atmosphere where words no longer held the same weight as feelings. Rachel. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. You know you deserve more than just existing, right? I've always seen that you're not like everyone else around here. You're alive. Those words broke through my defenses. I met his gaze, and in that moment, the space between us disappeared. We were sitting on a quiet rooftop under the stars, but it felt like this moment had lasted an eternity. He was like a magnet, pulling me toward him. I don't know how it happened. One moment we were looking at each other. The next, I felt his closeness. He leaned in, and I didn't pull away. Everything felt like a haze. Inside, something screamed that this was wrong, but I couldn't stop. His lips touched mine, and the kiss was like an explosion I had been waiting for but feared. When we pulled apart, the silence was deafening. I couldn't breathe. My heart was racing so fast, it felt like it would burst out of my chest. We both knew that we had just crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. I'm sorry, I whispered, but I didn't believe my own words. Jason looked just as confused, but in his eyes there was that same spark, now turning into a fire. He looked at me and quietly said, "This isn't just a moment of weakness, Rachel." We both know that. I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. We sat on the edge of the rooftop, under the stars, but I felt like this wasn't just the end of the night. It was the beginning of something that couldn't be stopped. The crack that had once been small was now a chasm, and I was falling into it with every passing moment. The morning after that night was heavy and sluggish, like the humid air before a storm. I woke up earlier than usual, even before the first rays of sunlight pierced through the bedroom windows. Sleep had brought no relief, leaving me instead in a restless half-dream where the shadows of the kiss with Jason haunted my every step. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to organize my thoughts, but they were tangled, like wires knotted together. Why had this happened? Why had I let myself go so far? There were no answers, only a ringing silence that drowned out even my inner voice. Mark was still away on his business trip, and I knew that the silence between us would soon be broken. Deep down, I knew. What had happened couldn't just be erased or forgotten. The crack was too obvious now, and there would be no hiding it. I tried to act normal. I went down to the kitchen, made myself some coffee, turned on the radio to drown out my thoughts. But every time I held the cup in my hands, every time I looked at the dining table or stepped into the garden, thoughts of Jason followed me. Memories of that night kept surfacing in my mind like flashes of light. Moments I tried to push away, but they came back stronger. I decided I needed to get out of the house. It seemed that if I were among people, on a noisy street, it might disperse the heavy feeling inside. I threw on a jacket and hurried out, leaving the house behind as if trying to escape from myself. At the cafe, I sat by a small table near the window, watching the passers-by. People seemed so distant, absorbed in their everyday lives. I envied their simplicity, their clarity, but at the same time, I realized that my world would never be the same. I stared at the cup of coffee, unable to take even a sip. My thoughts kept returning to the kiss, to that moment when everything changed. I tried to convince myself that it was just a moment of weakness, that nothing serious had happened, but my heart told me otherwise. It wasn't just a moment of weakness, Rachel. We both know that. Jason's words echoed in my mind, as clear as if he were standing right beside me again. I closed my eyes, trying to push the memory away, but the more I resisted, the stronger the guilt became. My heart was beating too fast, as if it sensed that something was about to happen. When I returned home, I found Jason in the living room. He was sitting on the couch, lost in thought, and when I entered, his gaze immediately locked onto mine. The room filled with a heavy, tense silence, as if the air between us was thick with unspoken words. I didn't know how to act. I wanted to just walk past, avoiding conversation, but Jason didn't give me the chance to slip away. Rachel. His voice was quiet, but firm. I froze in the doorway, not daring to face him. We need to talk. My back tensed, as if he had touched me with an invisible hand. Talk. About this. About us. About what had happened. What is there to talk about? I mumbled, trying to keep my voice steady, but it trembled. It was a mistake, Jason. Things got out of control. I turned to him, hoping to see agreement in his eyes. I wanted him to say that it really was just a moment of weakness, that we had both overreacted. But instead, I saw something else in his gaze. There wasn't a hint of doubt. It wasn't a mistake. His words cut deep. I can't just forget it, Rachel, and neither can you. I froze. Inside, everything was turning upside down, but at the same time, I couldn't stop myself from asking, "What are you trying to say?" He stood up, walking closer, his gaze still intense but filled with sincerity. You feel it just as much as I do. This isn't just an impulse, it's more. I've seen you struggle with Mark, seen you lose yourself. Neither of us wanted this to happen, but it did, because it was inevitable. His words were too confident, too honest. I felt a strange mix of emotions stirring in my chest: fear, guilt, and, most terrifying of all, a faint sense of relief. He was saying what I had been too afraid to admit to myself. Jason, I clenched my fists, trying to regain control. This can't go on. You have to understand, this is wrong. I'm married. I love Mark. But do you really love him? His question hit me like a bolt from the blue. I blinked, stunned by his words. But deep down, I knew he had struck at the very sore spot that had been gnawing at me for so long. Do I love Mark? Or was it just habit, clinging to the remnants of a life we had once built together, but which was now crumbling before my eyes? I don't know, I finally answered, feeling something tear inside my chest. These words, my first honest words in a long time. Jason stood in front of me, his face serious, but something like understanding flickered in his eyes. He didn't say a word, just waited while I gathered my thoughts. I felt that this conversation had been inevitable, but it brought with it so much pain and guilt that I couldn't think clearly. I can't keep lying to myself, I whispered, feeling my throat tighten with emotion. But I can't betray Mark either. You've already betrayed him, Jason said quietly. But there was no judgment in his voice, only simple truth, a truth I couldn't run from. We both have. His words hit me to my core, and I realized there was no going back now. I had stood at the edge of a cliff, and I had stepped off it that night when I allowed myself to kiss him. Silence filled the room again, but this time it was different. It didn't press or suffocate, it just existed as part of us. Everything had changed, and now we had to find a way out of this labyrinth. I didn't know how I would live with this knowledge moving forward. The roar of engines filled the air, vibrations coursing through the asphalt, and the crowd around us seemed like part of this swirling energy. Jason and I stood at the edge of the track, surrounded by cars and people, all immersed in the thrill of the races. This chaos was a strange backdrop for what was happening between us. The rumble of the engines and the roar of the crowd filled the space, and I felt like, in this wild, loud environment, I could hide from my own thoughts. But it was just self-deception. Despite the noise around us, thoughts of Jason wouldn't leave me, like a shadow following my every step. His presence beside me was palpable, as always. He leaned in to shout over the roar of the races. "This isn't really your style, is it?" There was a faint smirk in his voice. I smiled in response, but inside everything tightened at what lay behind his words. It wasn't just a joke, it was something more, something we both wanted to say, but still kept inside. "Wouldn't say that," I laughed, watching another car take off from the starting line. "But, I think it's actually kind of exciting right now." "That's the point." He took a step closer, and again I could almost physically feel his breath. "Sometimes you have to step out of your comfort zone to see something new." I nodded, but didn't answer. Comfort zone. How long had I been out of mine? Since the moment Jason came back into our lives, everything I thought I knew felt distant, foreign. I was like an observer in my own reality, where I made decisions, but no longer felt they belonged to me. After the races, we found ourselves in the backyard of an old house, far from the noise and the crowd. It was quiet here, except for the distant hum of the cars still circling the track. The sun was setting, leaving thin pink streaks across the sky, and the air was filled with the smell of heated asphalt and gasoline. We sat on a low stone wall, and for a moment, I felt a rare sense of calm. But that feeling didn't last long. Jason was close again, and his presence stirred something inside me that I could no longer deny. "You know this isn't just a coincidence, right?" He spoke first, breaking the silence that felt too charged. I looked at him, and our eyes met again. It was inevitable. "What exactly isn't a coincidence?" I asked, though I knew the answer. Nothing between us had been accidental since the moment we allowed ourselves to cross that line. "What's happening between us? It's not just physical attraction, Rachel, and you know that." His words were direct, no evasions, and it felt both terrifying and liberating at the same time. He was telling the truth, a truth I'd been trying to escape for so long. I thought it was just an impulse, something I could somehow forget. But now I understood Jason was right. It wasn't just physical desire. There was a connection between us that grew stronger with each passing day. "I can't ignore it," I said quietly, afraid of my own words, yet feeling that I had nothing left to lose. "I thought I could, but I can't." He smiled, but there was something serious in that smile. He moved closer, sitting next to me on the wall, and now there was no space between us. "I can't ignore it either." His voice was soft, but there was a firm certainty in it. "You're more to me than just my brother's wife. You've always been different." I turned away, feeling his words sink deep inside me, breaking down the last remnants of the wall I'd tried to build between us. I could no longer deny what I felt. We sat in silence, but it was a silence filled with meaning. I felt something inside me shift, as if the world around us was becoming less certain, yet clearer at the same time. Jason wasn't just a temptation. He was someone who made me feel alive. "You deserve to be happy," he spoke again, his voice now softer, almost a whisper. "And if you can't find that happiness with Mark, you need to be honest with yourself." Honesty. I felt betrayed by that word, as if it were challenging me. I'd stopped being honest with Mark the moment I allowed myself that first kiss. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I'd stopped being honest with myself. I turned to Jason and met his gaze. In that moment, I realized that we were both making a choice. There were no words, just the understanding that what had happened between us could no longer be denied. His hand slid towards mine, and I didn't pull away. That touch wasn't just a gesture of closeness. It was something more, like sealing a deal I'd made with myself. We were no longer pretending that we could ignore this connection. I felt everything inside me shift, as all doubts gave way to what was happening here and now. When we pulled away, I already knew there was no turning back. We had both made our choice. This day, this moment, it had changed us. I had allowed myself to want, allowed myself to feel, and there was no longer any guilt, only the realization that I lived in a world where you couldn't ignore what was happening in your heart. Silence surrounded us again, but now it was not a silence between us, but within us. We both understood that this day marked the beginning of something new, something that could no longer be hidden or suppressed. The day started as usual. No omens, no warning signs, just another ordinary day in our quiet, almost sterile life with Mark. I got up early, drank a cup of coffee, and tried to dive back into the routine, searching for some kind of stability in it. The events of the past few weeks weighed me down like a stone tied to my legs, but I kept moving forward as if nothing had happened. Mark came back from his business trip, tired but greeting me warmly, as always. We ate dinner in silence, the kind that had become familiar, and perhaps it was this very silence that had saved us for so long. In it, I could hide, concealing from him everything that was tearing at me inside. But silence couldn't last forever. That evening, when everything changed, I was standing by the window, staring at the darkening horizon. The night was warm and quiet, just like our life. Mark was sitting at his computer, engrossed in work. It seemed like everything was normal, but I could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. I turned to him when I heard him exhale quietly, as if something he had read or seen on the screen had irritated him. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. He didn't respond immediately. His face was unreadable, as if he were thinking something over, weighing it. "Rachel," he finally said slowly, his voice oddly calm. "Can you come over here?" Everything inside me froze. My heart stopped for a moment, and I knew something was wrong. I stepped toward him, but as I approached the desk, a chill ran down my spine. Mark turned the screen toward me, and I saw what I feared most. A video from that rooftop party where Jason and I had been far too close to each other. The video was shot from a distance, with the dancing crowd in the background, but even in the blurry outlines, it was clear that Jason and I were standing face to face. Too close, too intimate. My blood ran cold. Mark said nothing, simply watching my reaction. I felt the world around me collapse, but his calmness was even more terrifying than if he had screamed or demanded explanations. "What is this?" His voice was quiet, but there was a strength in it that left me unable to respond right away. I opened my mouth, but the words stuck in my throat. What could I say? "It's not what you think?" Those words seemed so absurd, so useless in the face of what he had seen with his own eyes. Everything I had carefully hidden was now laid bare before him, exposed and merciless. "It's just a coincidence," I finally forced out, though I knew it was a lie. A coincidence. How could I call what had happened between Jason and me a coincidence? Mark rose from his chair, slowly, but with certainty. He was tall, always so composed, and now his figure seemed to fill the entire room. He didn't yell, didn't openly accuse me, but his silence was louder than any words. "You think I didn't notice?" His voice was cold as ice. "Did you really think I was that blind?" Those words hit me harder than I could have imagined. I knew he had suspected something, but I had hoped all along that my secrets would remain locked away. Yet I couldn't answer his question. All I could do was stand there and watch as his world crumbled, as our world crumbled. "Rachel," he came closer, his gaze steady, as if he had been preparing himself to ask the question that had been gnawing at him for some time. "Tell me one thing. Is this still happening? Are you with him?" I couldn't breathe. The question hung in the air like a heavy weight, ready to crush us both. I. The words wouldn't come, as if I were trapped between truth and lies. I couldn't say yes, but no was no longer the truth either. Everything was far more complicated. "You don't have to answer." He looked at me with such bitterness that I felt myself shrink inside. "Your eyes already told me everything." He stepped away from me, as if he could no longer bear to be near, as though I were a poison that had tainted his life. I stood there, frozen, feeling as if my feet were glued to the floor. I knew this was the end, but I couldn't force myself to move. Mark didn't say anything else. He just went into the bedroom, leaving me alone with the crushing weight of his silence. I didn't run after him. I stayed in the living room, feeling the darkness close in around me. My secret was on the verge of being fully exposed, and now I knew that this was just the beginning. Time after that evening passed slowly, like in a slow-motion movie. Every moment dragged on, like a sticky thread that clung to my thoughts, preventing me from focusing on anything other than what was about to happen. Mark was silent. He no longer brought up the topic, didn't ask questions, didn't make accusations, but his silence was deafening. It weighed on me like a massive burden I could no longer carry. I knew this silence couldn't last forever. We lived in the same house, but felt like strangers. I watched him when he had breakfast, when he left for work, when he returned home, but there was an insurmountable barrier between us. My lie. It filled every space, every room. I couldn't hide it anymore. I had put off this moment for so long, as if hoping that somehow it could all be reversed. But the day came when I realized I couldn't hide anymore. I had to tell the truth. Mark was sitting in the living room, flipping through some documents, when I approached him. Inside, I was trembling, but I knew I couldn't delay any longer. These long days of silence were unbearable. Mark, we need to talk. My voice was quiet, but it lacked its usual lightness. He looked at me, his gaze impenetrable, as if he was bracing for the worst. But even then, I knew. He couldn't imagine what I was about to say. I can't keep hiding this anymore, I continued, feeling the cold creeping through my body. I have to tell the truth. He froze, slowly setting the documents aside. The tension in the room was thick, as if time had stopped. I felt that this moment would determine everything. What are you talking about? His voice was steady, but I heard the hidden tension in it. He wasn't ready for what I was going to say, but he was still waiting. I took a deep breath, trying to gather the last remnants of courage that still remained inside me. It's about Jason, I spoke, trying not to look at him. But after the first word, I realized there was no point in hiding. I had to look him in the eyes. Something happened between us, more than I wanted to admit. We were too close. The words cut like a knife. I saw how his face changed. A shadow of disbelief, suspicion, and then shock. He remained silent for a long time, just staring at me, as if trying to process what he had just heard. You mean? His voice was barely a whisper, but that made it even more terrifying. You were with him? You betrayed me? I couldn't breathe. Everything inside me tightened, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. I knew this moment would come, but the realization that I was now destroying everything we had was unbearable. Yes, I answered, my voice barely trembling. I didn't want it to happen. It was a mistake. But it happened. Mark stood up. His face was pale, as if all the blood had drained from it. He stepped toward the window, turning away from me. I stood in the center of the room, as if glued to the spot, not knowing what to do next. I felt that this conversation was no longer in my hands. How could you? His voice sounded like a thunderclap, dull and full of pain. He slowly turned to me. How could you do this to me? To us. There was so much pain in his eyes that I wanted to disappear. I don't know, I whispered. Everything got out of control. I thought I could handle it, that it would just pass. Pass? His voice exploded with the sudden fury he had been suppressing for so long. You thought you could continue this as if nothing was happening? You slept with my brother and thought it would pass? He stepped toward me, but not to threaten. It was a step of pain, a step of despair. I saw his hands clenching into fists, his lips trembling. But he said nothing more. He just stood there, as if his body didn't know what to do. Mark, I began, but he raised his hand, as if cutting off my words. I don't want to hear another word. His voice was icy. You betrayed me. I froze, feeling my knees weaken. All those years, everything we had built together, it was now shattered. He gave me one long, pained look, and then turned away. I can't handle this right now, he said quietly, and left. Just left the room, without saying another word. I was left alone in the living room, and the silence was terrifying. It was like a vacuum, sucking the last remnants of strength from me. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Everything inside me was screaming, but I couldn't find a way out of the pain. It seemed like hours had passed when there was a knock on the door. Jason. I didn't want to see him, not now. But gathering my strength, I opened the door. I saw that he left, Jason said quietly, his voice lacking its usual lightness. Did you tell him? I nodded, and tears welled up in my eyes. Everything had collapsed. You can't stay here, he continued. We can leave. Start over. I'll take care of you. Those words were like a tempting idea. Leave, escape, leave everything behind. But I couldn't decide. Something inside me was holding me back. I couldn't just erase the past. I don't know, Jason, I finally said. It's too complicated. He took my hand, his gaze full of determination. We'll manage. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to suffer for something that's already broken. I wanted to believe him, wanted to think that we could have a future. But inside, a feeling grew that I had already crossed a line beyond which there were no easy solutions. I needed time. I couldn't just run away. Give me time to think, I said, feeling the tears streaming down my cheeks. I can't decide now. Jason let go of my hand, nodded. But in his eyes, I saw what I feared. Uncertainty. He was waiting for an answer, but I couldn't give him one. I was torn apart, and no decision seemed right. The silence filled the room again, and I was left alone, surrounded by the emptiness of my choices. Time seemed to stand still after that last night, when I was faced with a choice that felt impossible. Days turned into nights, but inside me, nothing changed. I was suspended, between the past and the future, between what I had lost and what I was afraid to find. In this limbo, I searched for answers, but they all seemed elusive, like water slipping through my fingers. Mark didn't come back home. In his absence, the house felt empty, a reflection of my own state of mind. I wandered through the rooms, looking at everything that once seemed important, but now had become a reminder of what I had lost. The furniture, the photographs, the objects from our past, all of it no longer mattered. Jason kept waiting. His persistence was almost touching, but I sensed another force behind it, a desire to escape, to close his eyes to reality and start fresh. He often came by, looking at me with that same hopeful gaze, but I couldn't give him what he was waiting for. Are you still thinking? He asked one day, standing at the doorway. His voice was soft, but there was a hidden weariness in it. I nodded. I didn't want to repeat the same words again, but I knew I couldn't delay the decision any longer. I was on the brink of a choice that would change everything, but inside, I still had too many questions I couldn't answer. Jason. I looked at him, feeling the words come together on their own. I can't leave with you. He froze, as if he hadn't expected those words, although I'm sure he sensed this was coming. There was a flicker of pain in his eyes, but he didn't argue. Why? He asked after a long pause, in which I felt myself falling into emptiness. Because I still don't know who I am. I don't know what I want. I can't start a new life until I figure myself out. My words were unexpectedly sincere. I could no longer hide behind excuses, could no longer ignore my inner fears. I don't want to depend on you or anyone else. I need time. He was silent, lowering his gaze. I saw how his shoulders tensed, how he struggled not to say something that might make me stay. But in the end, he simply nodded, as if he understood something important for himself. I understand, he said quietly, but his voice was filled with bitterness. I can't make you. He took a step back, as if giving me space. I stood in the doorway, feeling how this decision was tearing apart everything that connected us. I loved Jason, but my love for him was tangled, mixed with guilt and an attempt to escape reality. I couldn't build a future on such a foundation. You deserve happiness, he said, and his words felt like a farewell. If you ever figure out what you want, find me. I couldn't respond. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I forced myself to stay calm. This moment was necessary. He left. I watched as his car disappeared around the corner, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders. Not all at once, but slowly. I was free, though it hurt. When Mark returned, he was different. I could see it in his eyes, in the way he moved, in the way he looked at me. He already knew it was over. We both knew we had passed the point of no return, and going back to the way things were was impossible. I'm leaving, I said when he walked into the house. His silence was the response I expected. He just looked at me, as if he had already known this was going to happen. Are you sure? His voice was hoarse, but there was no reproach in it. Yes, I nodded. We need time, both of us. I don't know what's next, but I know one thing. I can't stay here and keep living like this. Everything has changed. Mark slowly sat down on the couch, burying his head in his hands. His posture was full of exhaustion, and I felt his pain mirror my own. But I couldn't allow myself to be part of that pain anymore. We were both suffering, and I couldn't keep deceiving him or myself. I don't know what to say, he finally spoke. Maybe it's for the best. We sat in silence for a long time, and it was a calm silence. There was no more anger, no more blame, only weariness and emptiness. The next morning, I packed my things. There was no point in delaying. I understood that if I didn't leave now, I might never be able to. Everything I had known, everything I had built, it was now in the past. I was leaving behind the house that had once been my sanctuary, but had now turned into a prison. Mark said nothing when I left. We both knew it was the only right choice. I didn't look back as I closed the door behind me. An unknown path lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. I didn't know where I was going, but it no longer mattered. I was starting a new life, without Mark, without Jason, without everything that had held me back in the past. I was walking into the unknown, but this unknown was filled with the promise of a new beginning, something I had been afraid of for so long. The car moved down the highway, the city lights fading in the distance, and I felt that with every mile, it became easier to breathe. I was no longer tied to the past, to expectations or fears. Now I was free, and that freedom had become my new path.